Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners, to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester. Our program is Community Voices. I guess we could say that since the 1960s flowering of the second wave of feminism globally, but also in Australia, there have probably been many changes to the status and position of women in society, including in Australia, and many advances through changes particularly in legislation and rights and anti-harassment and a whole lot of other things. On the other hand, we might ask what is still left to do and what has really been achieved in that time. In Australia in 1975, a landmark, now iconic book was published by our guest today, Anne Summers, Damned Whores and God's Police, The Colonisation of Women in Australia. It's been reprinted many times in new editions. It still attracts a lot of interest and attention and still seems to provide people with some ideas about thinking about where to go with the project for the liberation, if you like, of women. So I'm delighted to welcome to the program here Anne Summers, who's joining us from her home here in Sydney. Hi, Anne. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Michael.
And with this book 50 years ago now, just to tackle the remarkable title, Damned Whores and God's Police. This book was essentially a cultural history in many ways of the position of women in Australian culture. And your argument was that we really do have to understand the specific culture within which we live beyond generalized issues of feminism, patriarchy and whatever. And we need to ground them in our own culture, society, place and time. So you carried out this historical cultural investigation and then looked at the position of women. What is this basic idea that you came from our cultural history of Damned Whores and God's Police?
Well, I think you've done me a favour of describing the book very accurately. I do get kind of a bit annoyed when people talk about it as a history book because while it certainly does look at Australian history, it does a lot more than that. And as you say, or as you implied, the reason for doing the book, the whole reason I was motivated to write this book was that it was at a time in the early 1970s when there were some wonderful books being written out of the emerging feminist movement, or in those days, as we called it, women's liberation. We didn't use the term feminism then, but there are a lot of wonderful books coming out of America. Kate Millett's book, Shulamith Firestone's book, Robin Morgan's book, all sorts of books. Similarly, a couple of great books coming out of the UK, and not to mention, of course, Germaine Greer's book, which was perhaps a little more international. But what struck me about the books coming out of America and out of the UK was that they were brilliant books, but they were talking about male chauvinism, which was a term we used then before sexism, male chauvinism and the oppression of women and all the multitude of ways in which women were not able to participate equally in our society, were located very much within their own cultures, and there were their own specific ways of treating women badly, if you like. And it seemed to me that while all this was very, very interesting, and we avidly devoured these books, and we certainly agreed with the basic philosophies and so on, and the political strategies that emanated from them, I felt that we needed to have our own story. We needed to understand the specific Australian nature of why it was women were treated the way that we were, and to some extent still are, in this country. So what was it about our culture, our history, our origins that led women to be treated in the way that Australians were? And one of the reasons that I think the book has been so successful and has lasted for so long is that the descriptions that I was able to provide of the ways in which women were treated rang so true with so many people. So it wasn't as if I was kind of exaggerating or making it up or just putting my own shine on things. I was describing a country and a culture that was so recognizable people responded viscerally to it. And the way in which I chose to kind of, if you like, package that story, that information, those insights, was by applying to Australia, particularly Australian version of the classic Madonna-whore dichotomy that has always been used to describe women in Western civilizations, Western cultures. And that is that women are either, good girls or bad girls, and the good girls are mothers and the bad girls are prostitutes, putting it very broadly. And the great thing for me when I was doing the research was when I came across, I mean, separately, I think more than a year apart, I came across the two terms. Firstly, damned whores, which was the term that Lieutenant Ralph Clark, who was a British Marine on the First Fleet, and he kept a diary of the voyage. He used the term damned whores to describe the female convicts, who he described as a bunch of disgusting women who were sexually reprobate, missing the point completely that the reason they'd been sent out by the British establishment was so they would be sexual partners for both the convict men and the soldiers, and therefore bring a bit of peace to the colony. So these women were forced to be whores and then were condemned for being so. So damned whores seemed to me to be a pretty good way of summing up the way in which women in Australia are treated sexually and often provoked into being bad girls and then condemned for being so. And the phrase God's police came from Caroline Chisholm, who used to be very well known for being on our $5 note, since removed. She was a champion of female emigration, and she ran an emigration society during the mid 19th century. And the whole idea of her work was to bring young, respectable girls out from Britain who would marry the wild colonial boys, tame them, and produce a respectable society. So she described these women as playing the role of God's police. And it just seems to me the two terms perfectly encapsulated the kind of country we were and the ways in which those two terms and the behaviours they described evolved part of the story. I mean, obviously it expressed itself differently over different eras, and in my view continues to do so. But they were particularly Australian expressions of keeping women down.
Well, in fact, you apply this concept a large proportion, but not by any means necessarily the biggest proportion of this very detailed and thorough and analytical book is a cultural analysis of the cultural history. And you talk about levels of culture and how, in a sense, the culture that we've got here in Australia reflects perhaps this underlying sexism and dualism in the sexist view. You talk, for example, about how that's reflected in our culture of literature, talk about it in terms of our intellectual life and how the story of Australia is told, but never really seems to tell the story of women and their experience. You also talk about our sporting culture and leisure and recreation and how all the things that we as a culture seem to value as a particular society are all focused on the male experience. In the case of sport, male bonding and purposeful violence and all the rest of it. And yet women don't seem to figure in any of these significant cultural pillars in our story, do they?
Well, that was the problem. I mean, when you started looking, we thought, well, maybe they just, forgot. But it turns out that there was we were erased from history. We were erased from culture. One of the things that I managed to discover in the course of doing, I spent 4 years researching and writing this book. I covered a huge amount of territory, learnt a huge amount. And it turned out that not all the books had in fact been written by men. There were books by women, they'd just been ignored. There were lots of women I was able to, if you like, bring into public consciousness. People like Barbara Bainton, who, is now quite well known, but at the time was lost to history. People like Elizabeth Harrower, who is, there are two biographies of Elizabeth about to be published now, 50 years later. And I was writing about Elizabeth Harrower as a genius who was completely unacknowledged in her own country. And various other writers. All we could think about were Patrick White and from Frank Morehouse of the younger generation, and those types of people. None of whom were at all interested in women, and there were no comparable women of comparable stature or award of comparable stature. It was the same with history. I mean, the history was a history of Australian men written by Australian men, in which women, appeared as the wives of governors and perhaps the wives of famous squatters and little much else. So it was a story in which the nation was built on this sort of male conception of what a country should be and what a culture should be. One of the things that's interesting, I guess, that when I first had the idea for the book and I first talked to Penguin about it, I proposed it to be a book about mateship because I thought that mateship was kind of the source of all of our problems. And I continued to think that for quite a while, but the more I read, the more I realized that it was mateship perhaps was a bit of a metaphor for everything else. There was so much else going on at every level of society, and not just in the past. It was, I was writing this in the 70s, and so I'm writing about David Williamson and Frank Morehouse and Michael Wilding and all of the current Richard Walsh and Martin Sharp and all of those. So that I was writing about the current, how shall I put it, cultural icons. And while they were radical in a sense, radical in opposing their fathers and the fathers' generation, they were far from radical when it came to women.
Take the sporting culture dimension that you write about. There's many things changed about women in sport, aren't there now? We've got the Matildas and we've got women professional football players. There's a lot more women's sport around these days. So there have been big changes.
That's not only true and remarkable and long overdue. I think it does show that there are changes, have been changes, but the trouble is that the changes, even when they occur and even when they're good, they're often never quite enough. I mean, it's taken. I don't really follow sports, so I can't talk very much authority about it. But I believe that it took a long time, and it still may not yet have fully happened for the women cricketers and the women footballers and the women tennis players to get the same amount of money as the men, for example. They were allowed to play, but they weren't allowed to be equal.
Sort of begs the question in a sort of idea sense, doesn't it? Whether this underlying analysis of the culture as explaining things, and whether over time, through activism and legislative changes, in a sense, the culture can be shifted, or does it shift, or is it just some changes at the margin with the underlying culture still there and the underlying tensions and issues?
Well, I think that's the question, and it's one that's not settled. I mean, we continue to resist, we continue to fight back. There have been amazing changes. We see many more women in positions of power and authority, and that makes a huge difference. We have women governors, we have a woman governor general, our second. We've had many women state premiers. We've only had one woman female prime minister, and that didn't go down very well and hasn't happened again. So it's a bit of a mixed story. But I mean, if you look at the current federal parliament, I mean, it's astonishing. The majority of members are now women, even though it's very lopsided with most of them being on the Labor side of things. But I mean, remember back when Gough Whitlam was elected in 1972, and he was, I guess, the face of modern Australia and the person in which we had such high hopes would modernise the country, including making things better for women, which he certainly did. But there wasn't a single woman in his government. So, I mean, there's been tremendous changes in that 50, 55 years or whatever it is. And that continues to happen, and that's great. And, women are majority at university now. They graduate in greater numbers than men. That's a bit of a mixed blessing. We don't want men to go backwards. We wanted equality, not domination. When it comes to the theatre, women have far more prominent roles. There are many more women theatre directors, many more women playwrights. Women's voices and women's ideas get far more airing than they ever did before. Women are very dominant, well, not dominant, but women are certainly have a huge presence in contemporary literature. So I think, yes, it has changed. It has got better, but we still haven't got there yet.
Our guest on Community Radio Northern Beaches, Anne Summers, author, Damned Whores and God's Police, The Colonisation of Women in Australia, written in 1975 and still in print, read by hundreds of thousands of people and still talked about to this day as an iconic piece of thinking about the project for women's liberation and the way forward. A central part or grand major thrust of your book, you deal with so many issues of culture and whatever, though, is the central role of the family. And you call it idealized and mythological status that the family seems to have in Australian culture and society, and the close way in which you argue that it's underpinned by these two sort of dualistic stereotypes. Why is the role of the family in Australia so unique? on the one hand, to our culture, and why is it so important in the issues that you're addressing for women's liberation?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I think it has changed quite significantly in the past 50 years. I mean, we now have gay marriage, which was unimaginable back then. We now have, I think, fewer people marrying than ever before. The rise of the single woman as she's no longer a pitied spinster, but she's an independent economic entity and social being in her own right. And more women are striving to live that way. Fewer and fewer women are having babies. There are major changes, and they're partly, or very much, I think, a reaction against the kind of iron grip that this traditional nuclear family had on us and had on people of my generation and even younger. It's such an unnatural way to live, despite what various religious people might say, and that more and more people are rejecting it. Why it developed away and did, I'm not sure that I can explain that anymore. I may have once had a theory, but it eludes me for the moment. But there's no doubt about its influence, and there's no doubt that it was the core issue around which women were judged. I mean, women had to be good wives and mothers. That was their role in society. And if they deviated from that in any way, they lost status, they lost respect, they were unlikely to obtain the economic protection of marriage, but without which it was very, very difficult for them to survive. So it was an absolutely key cornerstone to the way in which our society constructed itself. And it was one that was not good for women.
Still, many of the issues around today still see their relevance and context, don't they, perhaps, in the culture of family life, or don't they? I'm thinking about the very significant issues that we seem to face still after all these years of family domestic violence and death, and also of the mental health, let alone the economic dependence of women.
Domestic violence is very largely a reaction against women's independence and against women having their own choices and often wanting to be more independent than the traditional marriage arrangements allowed. I think the fact that domestic violence is increasing rather than decreasing, and that it's becoming more, how shall I put this? The methods of ways of oppressing women today are becoming more cunning, less physically violent, more psychologically damaging, more financially damaging. So these men who can't accept women as equals are finding clever and more clever ways to both punish them, deprive them of their rights, deprive them of equality, and in far too many cases, deprive them of their lives. And I think we can't escape seeing the connection there between women's wanting independence and this increase in violence. The other point I'd make, which takes up your thought that that the traditional marriage is still with us, or traditional family life is still with us. In some ways, that I agree with that, and I don't think it's as universal as it once was. But people often say to me, "Well, do the two stereotypes still exist?" And I said, I think they do. They're a bit different from the way that they've evolved over the decades and the generations. But I do think that there are still a lot of women who see themselves as God's police and who are proud of that role. And one of the reasons that they're proud of that role and they cling to it, and that is being in charge of the family and having the being the person who keeps the family together and is its moral center and guardian. It's one of the few areas of power that women are allowed in a lot of societies, including parts of our own. And it's something that women are proud of and very reluctant to. Some women think that if they give that up, they'll have nothing. Whereas a lot of other women think if they give that up, that's the opening of many new doors and a whole new way of living. The role of God's police is one that women have internalized very deeply, and some of them still cling to. There's the phenomenon at the moment of trad wives. There was this name, yummy mummies, that was applied to stay-at-home mums a decade or so ago. There's any way of glorifying and culturally rewarding women who play those traditional roles.
You speak a fair bit in the book about measures needed to achieve more equity, if you like, between men and women in all respects. And many of those things have been put in place, not least legislatively, from equal pay to human rights to legal rights, sex discrimination, and what have you. But I think you've also raised the question of whether, in achieving some of these goals of equality, that might be a bit of a double-edged sword. You say that women might become more like men, but they might not become liberated.
Well, I don't remember saying that, but it's not to say that I didn't say it, but I don't recall that, and I don't sort of think that now. But I mean, I guess it needs to be acknowledged that our thinking on these subjects has gone through a lot of changes, a lot of evolution over the past 50 or so years, and that many of the things that we thought back then we no longer think. There's a lot of things we didn't know back then that we now know. There are a lot of things. I mean, it's pretty remarkable when you think that that book, Damned Horse and God's Police, does not include the term domestic violence. It doesn't
No,
include the term sexual harassment. There are
indeed.
so many things that we have since that existed back then, but they hadn't been named. And it's once you name something, you give it power, and then you begin to understand it. Then you begin to learn, how to deal with it. But we were still operating at a very, very fundamental level back then of saying, we want equal pay, we want access to abortion, we want free contraception, we want no-fault divorce. But we didn't go much beyond sort of fairly basic structures of simple props, if you like, of equality. As we gained them, we suddenly realized that didn't solve everything. That in fact, there were new problems arose, or problems that have been there all the time revealed themselves differently. And so it's been a constant struggle, and there continue to be new issues emerging. I mean, for example, the issues facing older women when it comes to particularly women who've been dumped by their husbands and have no superannuation and no housing. So this is issues of poverty and abuse experienced by older women, not something that we dreamt about before. There are all kinds of issues that we know. So we're constantly, we're still busy at it, and still have a lot to do, despite all the terrific reforms that we have achieved.
You do speak, Anne, about what you call a colonized sex. That, in fact, is the subtitle of the original book, isn't it? The colonization of women in Australia, drawing presumably on colonialism thinking and ideologies and critiques, where you say that women have been denied control and self-determination, including of their bodies. And you talk particularly about the case of rape. But I'm wondering here that with the project that you're directed at, I struggle to know what to call it, if it's women's liberation, women's freedom, feminism, because all these terms have come to mean different things. But you at heart seem to be saying that real change, fundamental change on the methods of the way we organize ourselves as a society, requires in part a change in consciousness and an awareness by women themselves, who often, as I think you just mentioned, often have internalized these stereotypes and cultural views.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was no accident that one of the early activities of the women's liberation movement. I mean, the very early days in the late 60s and early 70s, that women used to hold what they called consciousness raising groups, and these were groups of where women would sit around and talk about their lives and sort of analyze the various things that they now realized were unfair or unjust or oppressive. And what we were doing really was undergoing a process of desocialization, of understanding that many of the things that we'd been brought up to believe were, essential to being a good woman, a good and nice girl, were in fact ways of keeping us down. And we needed to basically rethink what it was to be a woman. And the famous quote from Simone de Beauvoir, at the beginning of her book, that one is not born, rather one becomes a woman. Was something that we believe very strongly, that we weren't born this way, we became this way, and society did everything it could to ensure that we became that way and stayed that way. And women's liberation was a fight against that. We wanted to be different.
You've spent a career, certainly among other things, writing prolifically on these issues as a journalist and editor of high-profile magazines, as the author of many books and in public forums, but you've also been a real activist on the front line. You've lived and worked on these issues, not only in Australia, but America and Europe. And you address the question at the end of the book. What are the prospects looking forward for liberation? Still, all these new issues, presumably they're still rooted in the same sort of analysis, are they, that you've put forward? And what's the way forward?
Well, I think we continue to grapple with that, and it changes or it evolves as we understand things differently. I mean, when we started Elsie Women's Refuge, which was one of my areas of activism back in 1974, I was involved in that. Well, at the same time, I was trying to write this book, which was a bit of a challenge. As I said, I didn't ever use the word domestic violence in my book because no one talked about domestic violence. We talked about domestics. They were things that were kept private. There were things that, maybe the police had come, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe the woman pressed charges, mostly she wouldn't. It wasn't a big deal until we made it one. And so a lot of our history has been learning to confront hard truths and to try and understand the causes of them and how we deal with them and how we fix them. And often learning more about them has not made them go away, but in fact has exposed them to be far more complex and more difficult than we thought. And domestic violence is a typical example of that. As I just mentioned, the rate of violence is growing. The implications of that for women and for children who are exposed to it is quite horrifying. And we're working very hard to try to change this. But while there's huge sympathy, ostensibly, but from everybody about needing to protect women and children from violence, there's not a huge amount of action being done by governments that would actually end it. There's a lot of talk, but there's not nearly enough action, and I think that's true in a lot of areas where we say we want more women to do things, but do we really? Where's the effort? When effort is made to make something happen, it can happen, but when something is just lip service, well, it doesn't happen.
Well, Anne Summers, you're a high-level political advisor to prime ministers, I think to Hawke and to Keating along the way. How do you view the current political attitudes towards these issues?
Well, it's a changing area. I mean, as I mentioned before, we've got more women in Parliament, federal Parliament, than ever before. And the first time ever, the federal cabinet has a majority of women. On the Labor side, things look pretty good, but it's taken 30 years of quotas to achieve that. Having a lot of women in Parliament does make a huge difference towards attitudes to women's policy. And so there has been terrific movement in things like paid parental leave, things like childcare, things like pay equity. I mean, we still don't have equal pay despite it being legislated. So having a lot of women there does create the will and the motivation to make change. The Liberals have been in a state of absolute denial for decades about what they need to do to attract women into their party. And this is because they don't want them. They absolutely don't want them there, so they don't care. Now, they're going through a big charade at the moment saying they do care, and they've now appointed a woman leader, and they're going to do something about it. Well, we'll see. We'll see. If they want to do something about it, they have to have quotas. They have to take concrete steps that will ensure that change will happen. And I can't see the Liberal Party doing that. So you've got this great kind of contradiction, I guess, that on the one side of politics, massive things are happening with women and for women and by women. And on the other side, virtually nothing. So both things can be true at the same time, that women are doing very, very well in one area and very, very badly in another. Women, of course, have realised this, and it's reflected in their vote. So, women aren't dumb.
Well, Anne Summers, we can see over at least the 50 years since you published Damn Horse and God's Police that many things have changed, and perhaps it's relatively easy, but it's been a struggle to change laws, policies, and institutions. But perhaps the longer term project towards which you're directed, and as you say, perhaps depends for major change on significant changes in the underlying culture, values, and stereotypes, particularly in this case between men and women. It might prove a much longer and more difficult challenge, issues so deeply embedded in our psyches and our history. Thanks for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches, Anne.
It was a great pleasure, Michael. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for reading the book so thoroughly.
Michael Lester also produces 2 musical shows, so if you'd like to listen to those, jump on to rnb.org.au and listen live.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rnb.org.au.